spare parts. One morning, Edward pulled into Oakham Road with a train of stone trucks. The harbour at Queen's Wharf was nearly finished, but there was still a lot of work to do. Much to Edward's surprise, only two of the Oakham Road engines, Tom and Chelsea, were there, waiting for his trucks. Both of them were looking downcast. "Good morning," Edward whistled cheerfully. The other two engines replied in kind, but with a lot less enthusiasm. "Morning, Edward," sighed Tom. "Morning," Chelsea said quietly. "What's wrong?" asked Edward. "You look absolutely miserable." "We were just talking about Thomas," Chelsea sighed. "He came here this morning with another load of trucks and looked just as low as he did yesterday." "Yes, he's still feeling upset about his brothers," Tom said sadly. "And so are we. We just can't stop thinking about Leo." "Neither can I," said Edward mournfully. "It was such a shame too. He was a good engine, a very brave one too, but it's a shame he wasn't preserved. He would have fit in here nicely." Then he paused, looking concerned. "By the way, where's Ross?" "He's not feeling well," Chelsea explained. "All his joints ache and he can't breathe properly. He couldn't even get out of the sheds this morning." "The men at the works are trying to make him better," said Tom, "but they don't have any spare parts to replace his old ones. He's very high-strung, you know. Not just any old parts will do, and he can't be spared from service while his old parts are being recast." "Oh dear," said Edward. "Is there anything I could do to help?" "Well, as a matter of fact, there is," said a well-known voice. The new controller stepped into view. "I've just been on the phone to the Fat Controller," he said. "He's agreed to allow me to borrow you for a while, Edward." "Oh?" said Edward, a little taken aback. "Does this mean I'll be working on Oakham Road while Ross has been mended, sir?" The new controller chuckled. "Not quite, Edward," he smiled. "I want you to go to the other railway for me. They say that they've got a large number of spare parts in storage at Eastleigh Works in the southern region. I'd like you to pick them up and bring them back here." "Eastleigh?" asked Tom. "I remember that place. That was where I was sent for repairs when I worked at Southampton. It's also the place where a lot of my friends were broken up." "Wasn't that the place where Leo was sent to?" asked Chelsea. "Indeed it is," said Edward thoughtfully. "Sir, just out of interest, why have the other railway kept these parts? They no longer own any steam engines." "Just be glad they did," said the new controller. "My guess is they just kept them in case they were needed for any last-minute repairs. But they never used them, and just never got round to sending them to the scrapyard. Anyway, off you go, Edward, and get some rest. You've got a long journey ahead of you in the morning." "Yes, sir," Edward replied, and puffed away. The next morning, Edward woke bright and early. Boko promised to look after the branch line while he was away, and Donald promised to look after the trucks. After saying goodbye, Edward puffed out of the sheds and headed for the main line. The trip to the other railway was long. Edward puffed across the island, then over the bridge to the mainland. After running all day, Edward spent the night in the shed with several diesels. The diesel made him welcome, and Edward was sad to leave the next morning. By the time he arrived at Eastleigh, it was very late indeed, and Edward spent the night at an old shed. This time he was all alone. He didn't mind at all, for he was so tired that he fell asleep at once. Edward awoke early next morning as his driver and fireman lit his fire. "We're leaving early, old boy," said his driver. "The Fat Controller wants us home by nightfall. We'll leave once we've found our trucks." "Right," Edward yawned, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what Chelsea had said. Wasn't that the place where Leo was sent to? Edward was still daydreaming when he found his trucks. They were standing in an old shed at the back of the works, which hadn't been used in a long time. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, which had large holes in places, and dust was thick everywhere. His fireman ran a finger across an old window pane, which was soon covered with thick, grey dust. "This place has been used for years," he said, brushing the dust off his jacket. Edward wasn't listening. He was looking around, peering into the gloom. Everything was still and very eerie. He didn't like it here. He couldn't help thinking back to Thomas's story, and how many engines met their end in many sheds just like this one. Edward shuddered. He wanted to get out of the shed as soon as possible. When his driver pulled the lever, he jerked forward suddenly, accidentally bumping the trucks hard. A rusty hinge on one of the trucks gave way, and its load cascaded over the floor, covering the ballast in sleepers in a pile of metal parts. Edward jumped and shot backwards violently. "Whoa, Edward, whoa!" cried the driver, quickly applying the brakes. "What's bitten you?" "I don't like it in here," Edward shivered. "I understand, old boy," said the driver sympathetically. "Let's get this mess cleaned up and get on home." Edward waited while his driver went for help. Soon a diesel came with some workmen and a spare truck. Edward felt embarrassed. He never usually made mistakes. He was worried that the Fat Controller would be cross with him. The men began loading the pieces into the truck. "I don't understand why you need all this old junk," said the diesel, staring at the pile of parts. "I can understand needing spares, but why would you want stuff like an old number plate?" "A number plate?" asked Edward, raising an eyebrow. "Where?" "Down there, by that old dome," said the diesel, glancing down. "You mean this?" asked the workman. He lifted up an old number plate and rubbed some of the dust off. Something about it caught Edward's eye. "Excuse me," he asked. "What's it say?" The man rubbed some more dirt off with the back of his sleeve. "It's very old," he said. "The number says 32109. "Excuse me?" said Edward's driver, turning round. "Did you say 32109? "Yes," said the workman. "Does it mean anything to you?" "Leo!" breathed Edward. Then he noticed something else. "Look! Down there!" he exclaimed. "There's an old safety valve." His driver picked it up. "You're right," he said thoughtfully. "There's a dome and cylinder too," cried Edward. "What of it?" asked the diesel. "There's loads of them in there." "No, there's not," said the fireman, examining the parts. "There's just one or two of each part." "We've got ourselves a whole engine in here!" he exclaimed. "It's just in pieces!" "Do you think it's Leo?" asked Edward, aghast. "I'm sure it is!" cried the driver. "Wait here!" He ran out of the shed and into the manager's office. By the time the driver returned, the men had finished loading the truck. He looked very excited. "What is it?" Edward asked. "I've just spoken to the Fat Controller," explained the driver, "and he's telephoned the new controller. They want us to bring all these parts back to the works with us." Edward's mouth fell open. "Do you mean—" he breathed. "Can they do it?" "That, old boy, we'll just have to wait and see," said his driver, beaming from ear to ear. "Thomas certainly will be surprised." As Edward puffed home that day, he kept thinking back to the special load he carried in his trucks. He'd gone to the other railway for spare parts, but he was returning with something more. Much more. "I just hope it works," he puffed to himself as he pulled into the works that evening. I hope so. Don't you?